The thunderclap that shook the windows of Seattle Family Court seemed to announce the arrival of something terrible. Judge Catherine Morrison looked up from her papers as lightning illuminated the Gothic courthouse windows, casting eerie shadows across the mahogany-paneled courtroom. She had been presiding over family disputes for 23 years, but something about today felt different, ominous, like the storm brewing outside. 8-year-old Maya Thompson sat rigidly in the witness section, her small frame dwarfed by the imposing leather chair. Her legs dangled several inches from the floor, and her tiny hands were clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. She wore a navy blue dress that her mother had carefully pressed that morning, along with shiny black shoes that clicked nervously against the chair legs whenever anxiety overtook her stillness. Maya's dark hair was pulled back in 2 neat braids, but several strands had escaped and now framed her pale, heart-shaped face. Her almond-shaped eyes, a beautiful blend of her father's Irish green and her mother's Chinese brown, darted nervously between the 2 people who were supposed to love her most, but now seemed like strangers engaged in a war where she was both the prize and the casualty. Detective Rick Thompson sat at the plaintiff's table, his broad shoulders straining against his best courtroom suit. At 42, he still carried himself with the military bearing he'd learned in the Marines before joining the Seattle Police Department. His jaw was set in a hard line, and his green eyes blazed with an intensity that made even seasoned criminals uncomfortable during interrogations. Today, that same intimidating stare was fixed on his soon-to-be ex-wife. Rick's massive hands shuffled through a stack of documents with barely contained rage. Each paper represented another weapon in his arsenal against the woman he had once promised to love forever. Medical school transcripts, hospital schedules, therapy bills, school reports, anything that could paint Dr. Sarah Chun as an unfit mother. His wedding ring had been removed months ago, leaving a pale band of skin that he unconsciously rubbed whenever his anger threatened to overflow. "This is all her fault," Rick muttered under his breath to his attorney, loud enough for everyone in the small courtroom to hear. "She destroyed our family for her precious career. Maya barely knows her own mother anymore." Dr. Sarah Chun sat at the defendant's table, looking fragile and exhausted. At 38, she was one of the youngest trauma surgeons at Seattle General Hospital, but the stress of the divorce proceedings had aged her visibly. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her usually impeccable appearance showed signs of the chaos consuming her life. Her black hair was pulled into a simple bun, and she wore a conservative gray suit that made her look older than her years. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she reviewed her own stack of papers, character references from colleagues, Maya's school performance records showing excellent grades and no behavioral problems, and documentation of Rick's increasingly explosive temper. She kept glancing toward Maya, her heart breaking each time she saw her daughter's terrified expression. "Your Honor," Sarah's attorney, Margaret Walsh, whispered, "we need to address the intimidation factor here. Look at that child, she's petrified." Judge Morrison had indeed noticed Maya's condition. The child sat frozen like a small statue, barely breathing, her eyes wide with the kind of fear that no 8-year-old should ever experience. Morrison had seen hundreds of children caught in custody battles, but Maya's stillness was unnatural, almost catatonic. Most children fidgeted, cried, or acted out during these proceedings. Maya simply disappeared into herself, as if trying to become invisible. The storm outside intensified, and another thunderclap made Maya flinch violently. Her whole body jerked, as if she'd been struck, and for a moment, Judge Morrison thought the child might bolt from the room. But Maya remained frozen, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. Rick Thompson's voice suddenly boomed through the courtroom like another clap of thunder. "Your Honor, I've been a detective for 15 years and a father for 8. I know what children need And they need stability. They need a parent who's actually present. He slammed his fist on the table, causing papers to scatter and everyone in the room to jump, including Maya, who let out a barely audible whimper. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Morrison warned sternly, "you will control yourself in my courtroom." But Rick was beyond control now, fueled by months of rage and hurt. "She abandoned us." Maya would come home from daycare, asking why Mommy was never there. For bedtime stories, why she missed every school play, every soccer game. Sarah chose her residency over her own daughter. Sarah Chun's composure finally cracked. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "That's not true. I was building a career to provide for our family. I never wanted to miss those moments." But Rick wouldn't help with childcare. He said it wasn't a man's job. "That's a lie." Rick roared, half rising from his chair. "I worked double shifts to support your medical school dreams, and this is how you repay me? By trying to steal my daughter?" Maya's breathing had become dangerously rapid now, each intake shorter and more desperate than the last. Her small body began to tremble, and beads of sweat appeared on her forehead, despite the courtroom's air conditioning. Judge Morrison recognized the signs. The child was having a panic attack. The storm outside reached a crescendo, with rain lashing against the windows and wind howling through the eaves of the old courthouse. Inside, another kind of storm was building as two people who had once loved each other enough to create a beautiful child now tore each other apart with words sharp enough to wound everyone within range. Maya's world was collapsing around her, and she was drowning in the fury of her parents' hatred. She needed a lifeline, a savior, someone to make the terrifying words stop echoing in her ears. As her vision began to blur and her chest tightened with panic, Maya's desperate eyes searched the courtroom for any sign of hope. She had no idea that salvation was just moments away from walking through those imposing courtroom doors. The massive oak doors of Seattle Family Court creaked open with a sound that cut through the heated arguments like a sword through silk. The courtroom fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the steady patter of rain against the Gothic windows and Maya's labored breathing. Every head turned toward the entrance, where a figure emerged from the storm-darkened hallway like something from a heroic legend. Colonel Elena Rodriguez stood in the doorway, water droplets still clinging to her immaculate military dress uniform. At 74, she carried herself with the bearing of someone who had commanded respect on battlefields across 3 continents. Her silver hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her steel-gray eyes swept the courtroom with tactical precision. The ribbons and medals adorning her chest told the story of a distinguished career: Purple Heart, Bronze Star, Combat Action Badge, each one earned through blood, sweat, and unwavering courage. But it wasn't the decorated war hero that commanded everyone's attention. It was the magnificent creature walking calmly beside her. Ranger was a German shepherd of extraordinary presence, standing 26 inches at the shoulder with a coat that gleamed like burnished copper and charcoal. His intelligent amber eyes held an ancient wisdom that seemed to understand human suffering in ways that defied explanation. The pristine service dog vest he wore was adorned with patches indicating his specialized training: PTSD service dog, do not pet, and working dog. His gait was perfectly measured, each step deliberate and confident, as if he were patrolling a military compound rather than entering a civilian courthouse. Colonel Rodriguez had driven through the worst storm Seattle had seen in years to be. Here today, she had received Sarah's desperate phone call at 4 in the morning, sobbing about the custody hearing and how terrified Maya had become of her own father. Elena Rodriguez didn't make idle promises or offer empty comfort. She took action. Within 30 minutes, she was on the road with Ranger, navigating flooded highways and fallen trees to reach her great-granddaughter in her hour of need, Maya's Transformation was instantaneous and miraculous. The moment her eyes locked onto Ranger's familiar form, color flooded back into her pale cheeks. Her death grip on the chair loosened, and for the first time in hours, she took a full, deep breath. A whispered Ranger escaped her lips, barely audible, but filled with such relief and joy that it made several courtroom observers tear up. The bond between Maya and Ranger had been forged during countless summer visits to Colonel Rodriguez's ranch in eastern Washington. While other children might have been content with ordinary pets, Maya had found her soulmate in this extraordinary service dog. She had watched in fascination as Ranger performed his duties, alerting to Elena's panic attacks, providing deep pressure therapy during nightmares, creating protective barriers in crowded spaces. More importantly, Maya had discovered that Ranger's calming presence worked on her too. During Elena's PTSD episodes, Maya had often curled up next to Ranger, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing chase away her own fears about her grandmother's war memories. She had learned to read his subtle signals, the tilt of his ears that meant he was monitoring a situation, the way his body positioned itself as a living shield, the gentle pressure of his chin resting on someone's lap when comfort was needed most. Ranger's training was extensive and specialized. After Elena's return from Afghanistan, where an IED explosion had left her with severe PTSD, nightmares, and hypervigilance, she had been paired with Ranger through a prestigious service dog program. He had been trained to detect the chemical changes that preceded panic attacks, to interrupt nightmares through gentle nudging, to perform room searches for safety, and to provide deep pressure therapy during episodes. His success rate was remarkable, but his most impressive skill was his ability to assess and respond to emotional distress in anyone Elena cared about, including Maya. Judge Morrison watched this reunion with growing amazement. She had presided over thousands of cases involving children in crisis, but she had never witnessed such an immediate and profound change in a child's demeanor. Maya's breathing had normalized completely. Her trembling had stopped, and though she remained in her chair, her entire body language had shifted from terror to hope. Rick Thompson's reaction was immediate and explosive. "What is this circus?" he demanded, his voice echoing off the courtroom walls. "Your Honor, this is clearly a calculated move to manipulate these proceedings. Service dogs have no place in a custody hearing." Colonel Rodriguez had not spoken since entering the courtroom, but now she stepped forward with the measured confidence of someone accustomed to command situations. "Your Honor, I am Colonel Elena Rodriguez, United States Army, retired. This is Ranger, my certified service dog, and I have proper documentation for his presence here today." Her voice carried the authority of someone who had briefed generals and negotiated with foreign diplomats. Sarah's attorney quickly stood. "Your Honor, Colonel Rodriguez is Maya's great-grandmother and has been a significant figure in the child's life. If the court requires verification of the service dog's credentials." "The dog goes now?" Rick interrupted, his face flushed with rage. "This is nothing but emotional manipulation designed to influence the court." But Judge Morrison was studying Maya's face with the experienced eye of someone who had dedicated her career to child welfare. The change in the little girl was undeniable and, frankly, miraculous. Where moments before had sat a child in the grip of a severe panic attack, now sat a little girl who was breathing normally, whose color had returned, whose eyes held hope instead of terror. Ranger remained perfectly still throughout the heated exchange, his intelligent gaze fixed on Maya. He was waiting, Judge Morrison realized. Waiting for a signal, a command, or simply waiting for the moment when this child might meet him. The dog's presence was not performance or manipulation. It was pure, unconditional readiness to serve and protect. As the arguments swirled around her, Maya's eyes never left Ranger's face, and his never left hers. Something profound and wordless was passing between them, a communication that transcended human understanding and touched the very essence of what it meant to provide comfort. In a world gone mad with adult anger and broken promises. The momentary peace that had settled over the courtroom with Ranger's arrival shattered, like glass against concrete, when Rick Thompson's rage found its second wind. His face had progressed from red to a dangerous shade of purple, the veins in. His neck bulging as he prepared to launch his most devastating attack yet. Judge Morrison had barely finished reviewing Colonel Rodriguez's service dog documentation when Rick exploded from his chair like a rocket fueled by months of suppressed fury and wounded pride. "Your Honor, this is exactly what I'm talking about." Rick's voice boomed through the courtroom with the force of a sonic boom, causing the elderly court reporter to flinch and nearly drop her stenography machine. "This woman," he jabbed his finger toward Sarah like he was pointing a weapon, "has been manipulating everyone around her since the day I met her. First my family, then our friends. Now she's using our daughter's own great-grandmother as a pawn in her sick games." Sarah Chun recoiled as if she'd been physically struck, her face draining of what little color had returned during the brief respite. Her hands began to tremble uncontrollably as she gripped the edge of the defendant's table, her knuckles turning white with the effort of keeping herself upright. The carefully constructed composure she had maintained throughout months of legal proceedings was crumbling before everyone's eyes. Rick was just getting started. 20 years of police interrogations had taught him exactly how to use his voice as a weapon, how to project authority and intimidation that could break hardened criminals. Now he turned that same devastating force on the mother of his child, seemingly oblivious to the collateral damage he was inflicting on Maya with every word. "She abandoned Maya when our daughter was barely 3 years old." Rick's fist crashed down on the plaintiff's table with such violence that law books jumped and scattered across the polished surface. The sound reverberated through the courtroom like a gunshot, causing the bailiff to instinctively move closer. "Medical school," she said. "It's for our future," she said. "But what about Maya's future? What about those nights when our baby cried for Mommy and Mommy was studying for another exam?" Maya's world began to tilt on its axis. The brief sanctuary she had found in Ranger's presence was being torn away by the familiar sound of her father's volcanic rage. Her small body began to curl inward, an unconscious attempt to make herself smaller, invisible, anything to escape the storm of adult fury that was consuming the air around her. Her breathing, which had normalized when Ranger arrived, began to quicken again, each intake more desperate than the last. She missed Maya's first steps because she was in anatomy lab, Rick continued, his voice rising to nearly a shout. She missed her first words because she was studying for boards. She missed birthday parties, Christmas mornings, bedtime stories, everything. That makes a mother a mother. And now she wants to pretend she deserves custody? Sarah finally found her voice, but it came out as little more than a wounded whisper. "Rick, please, not in front of Maya. She doesn't need to hear. She needs to hear the truth." Rick roared, wheeling around to face his ex-wife with the fury of a man who felt his entire world had been stolen from him. "She needs to know why Daddy had to work extra shifts to pay for daycare while Mommy played doctor. She needs to understand why our marriage fell apart because you chose everything else over your own family." The words hit Maya like physical blows. Each accusation, each angry revelation about her parents' failed marriage, felt like another crack forming in the foundation of her 8-year-old understanding of the world. Her chest began to tighten, that familiar crushing sensation that had become her constant companion since the divorce proceedings began. The walls of the courtroom seemed to be closing in around her, the adult voices becoming distorted and overwhelming. Maya's vision began to blur around the edges, a sure sign that one of her panic attacks was building to critical mass. her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for escape, and she could feel that terrible sensation of drowning, even though she was sitting in a chair, breathing air. The courtroom's fluorescent lights seemed to pulse and strobe, making everything feel surreal and nightmarish. She documented everything. Rick continued his assault, waving a thick folder of papers like a battle flag. Every missed dinner, every canceled weekend, every time she chose her precious career over our daughter. Maya would ask me, "Daddy, when is Mommy coming home?" And I had to lie to protect her feelings. I had to pretend that Mommy loved her when her actions proved otherwise. Sarah Chun broke completely. The composed, professional surgeon vanished, replaced by a sobbing woman whose heart was being torn apart in front of a room full of strangers. I loved her. I love her. Everything I did was for her, for our future. I wanted to build something better for our family. I never wanted, liar. Rick's voice reached a crescendo that made the windows rattle. You're still lying. Even now, even here, you can't admit the truth. You destroyed our family for your own selfish ambition. Maya's world exploded into chaos. The familiar crushing weight settled on her chest like a lead blanket, making each breath a monumental struggle. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably, and cold sweat beaded on her forehead, despite the courtroom's warmth. The arguing voices of her parents distorted into an incomprehensible roar of rage and pain that seemed to come from all directions at once. Through her panic, Maya's desperate eyes found Ranger across the courtroom. The magnificent German shepherd sat perfectly still beside Colonel Rodriguez, but his intelligent amber eyes were locked on Maya's face. He could sense what was happening. His training had taught him to recognize the subtle signs of psychological distress that preceded a full panic attack. His body was coiled with readiness, waiting for permission to act, to serve, to protect the child who had become part of his pack during those precious summer visits. Maya was drowning in her parents' hatred, gasping for emotional air that wouldn't come, and she needed a lifeline more desperately than she had ever needed anything in her short, turbulent life. In the depths of her panic, as the courtroom spun around her like a nightmare carousel, Maya's mind reached back to a memory that had been buried beneath months of fear and confusion. It was Christmas Eve, 6 months ago, at Colonel Rodriguez's ranch in the Cascade foothills. Snow had been falling softly outside the kitchen window as Maya sat cross-legged on the hardwood floor, douching in fascination as her great-grandmother worked with Ranger. "Watch carefully, Mia," Elena had whispered, her weathered hands moving with practiced precision. "These signals saved my life in Afghanistan, and now they help Ranger take care of me here at home. But they only work if both sides understand the language." Elena had taught Maya the basics of tactical hand signals that military working dog teams used in combat zones where a single spoken word could mean death. Each gesture was deliberate, economical, and absolutely silent. Touch your heart with 3 fingers, Elena had demonstrated, then point down twice. That means emergency assistance needed immediately. Ranger will come to you no matter what. Maya had practiced the movements dozens of times that Christmas visit, giggling as Ranger responded flawlessly to each signal. It had seemed like a magical game then, a special secret between a little girl and a war dog. She never imagined she would need to use it for real survival. Now, drowning in the chaos of her parents' mutual destruction, Maya remembered that Christmas lesson with crystalline clarity. Her father's voice had become a roar of accusation and rage that seemed to fill every corner of the courtroom. Her mother's sobs provided a heartbreaking counterpoint to the symphony of family destruction playing out before a room full of strangers. The fluorescent lights pulsed with a rapid heartbeat, and the walls seemed to be closing in like the trash compactor scene from Star Wars. Maya's chest felt like it was being crushed by an invisible weight. Each breath came in short, desperate gasps that provided no relief. Her hands were shaking so violently that she couldn't maintain a grip on the chair arms. Cold sweat beaded on her forehead, and her vision was starting to tunnel, darkness creeping in from the edges like storm clouds gathering for the final assault. Through the haze of her panic attack, Maya's eyes found Ranger across the courtroom. The magnificent German shepherd sat perfectly still beside Colonel Rodriguez, but every line of his body radiated alertness and concern. His intelligent amber eyes were locked on Maya's face with laser-like intensity, and she could see that he was reading the signs of her distress with the same precision that had once saved soldiers' lives in combat zones. Ranger's ears were pricked forward, his head tilted slightly in that characteristic way that meant he was assessing a situation and preparing to act. His breathing had synchronized with Maya's elevated rhythm, his nostrils flaring as he detected the chemical changes that accompanied severe anxiety. His muscles were coiled beneath his copper and charcoal coat, ready to spring into action the moment he received permission. Maya knew, with the intuitive wisdom that exists between souls who have truly bonded, that Ranger wanted to help her. He was waiting for her signal, waiting for permission to break protocol and cross the invisible barriers that adult rules had erected between them. All she had to do was ask, but not with words. Words would alert the adults, would draw attention, would turn her desperate need for comfort into another battlefield for her parents to fight over. Fighting against the crushing weight of her panic attack, Maya forced her trembling right hand to move. The courtroom seemed to fade away as she focused every ounce of her remaining strength on performing the movements that Colonel Rodriguez had taught her. Her hand felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds as she slowly, deliberately raised it toward her chest. 3 fingers. That was the first part of the signal. Maya pressed her index, middle, and ring fingers against her heart, feeling the wild hammering beneath her ribs. The gesture was so subtle that most adults in the room, focused as they were on Rick Thompson's thundering accusations, missed it entirely, but Ranger saw it. His entire body went rigid with attention, his amber eyes never leaving Maya's face. The second part of the signal was even more difficult. Maya's arm felt like jelly, her muscles weak with panic and terror. But she forced herself to complete the movement, dropping her hand and pointing downward twice in quick succession. Emergency assistance needed immediately. The signal that Elena Rodriguez had learned from military dog handlers in the mountains of Afghanistan, refined through years of working with PTSD service dogs, and passed down to a desperate 8-year-old girl as a lifeline in her darkest moment. The effect on Ranger was instantaneous and profound. Every instinct in his magnificently trained body recognized the signal for what it was, a call from someone he had sworn to protect. Without hesitation, without waiting for Colonel Rodriguez's permission, without regard for courtroom protocol or human social conventions, Ranger rose to his feet. The movement was fluid and purposeful, like watching a professional athlete perform a move they had practiced 10,000 times. There was no uncertainty in his gait, no hesitation in his bearing. This was a working dog responding to a legitimate crisis, and nothing in the world was going to stop him from reaching the child who needed him. As Ranger began his purposeful march across the courtroom, the heated arguments began to fade into background noise. Rick Thompson's accusations, Sarah Chun's desperate sobs, the judge's attempts to restore order, all of it became secondary to the extraordinary moment of interspecies communication that was unfolding before their eyes. Maya watched through, her tears as salvation approached on 4 legs, her heart still racing, but now with hope instead of pure terror. She had reached across the courtroom with nothing but a silent gesture, and her guardian angel was coming to save her. The secret signal that Elena Rodriguez had taught her as a game was about to become the most important communication of her young life. Every eye in the courtroom was now fixed on the German shepherd as he crossed the invisible line between the gallery and the active legal proceedings, but Ranger's focus remained unwavering. His mission was clear, his purpose absolute, and nothing would prevent him from reaching the little girl whose silent cry for help had pierced through the chaos of adult anger to touch the heart of a warrior trained to recognize genuine need. The magic of their bond was about to transform a courtroom into a sanctuary, and nobody present would ever forget the moment they witnessed love speaking its own ancient language. Judge Catherine Morrison's mahogany gavel hung suspended in mid-air like a frozen moment in time, her entire world reduced to the impossible decision playing out before her eyes. In 23 years of presiding over family court proceedings, she had seen every conceivable form of human drama, bitter custody battles, domestic violence cases, adoption proceedings gone wrong, and child welfare crises that would haunt her dreams for months. But never, in all her years on the bench, had she witnessed anything remotely like what was unfolding in her courtroom. Ranger moved across the polished marble floor with the precision of a military parade drill, each step calculated and deliberate. His powerful shoulders rolled beneath his copper and charcoal coat as he navigated between the gallery seats and the council tables, his intelligent amber eyes never wavering from Maya's small, trembling form. The courtroom had fallen into absolute silence, except for the soft click of his nails on the floor and Sarah Chun's muffled sobs from the defendant's table. Judge Morrison's mind raced through decades of legal precedent and courtroom protocol. Rule 43 of the Family Court Guidelines explicitly prohibited animals in active legal proceedings unless specifically approved in advance through proper channels. Rule 12 addressed courtroom disruptions and provided clear instructions for maintaining order and decorum. Section 8 of the Courthouse Security Manual outlined procedures for removing unauthorized individuals or animals from judicial proceedings. But standing in stark opposition to all these rules and regulations was something far more powerful: the unmistakable sight of a child in genuine crisis, being offered salvation by a creature whose only motivation was compassion and duty. Judge Morrison had spent her entire career learning to read people, to detect deception, to separate genuine need from manipulation and theatrics. What she was witnessing now was as authentic as a child's first cry at birth. Maya's transformation began the moment Ranger reached her chair. The magnificent German shepherd positioned himself with tactical precision, his strong body creating a living barrier between Maya and the chaos of adult anger that surrounded her. Without being commanded or directed, he performed what Colonel Rodriguez would later explain was called deep pressure therapy, a specialized technique where the service dog applies his full weight against the person in distress, providing a sense of grounding and security that can interrupt panic attacks and severe anxiety episodes. Ranger's warm, solid presence pressed gently against Maya's legs as he settled beside her chair. The child's ragged, desperate breathing immediately began to slow and deepen. The death grip she had maintained on the chair arms loosened as her small hands found their way into Ranger's thick fur, her fingers tangling in the soft undercoat that had been warmed by his body heat. Color began to return to her pale cheeks like sunrise breaking over a winter landscape. The physiological changes were dramatic and undeniable. Maya's heart rate, which had been racing at dangerous levels during her panic attack, began to slow toward normal. Her trembling subsided as Ranger's steady breathing created a rhythm that her own respiratory system instinctively began to match. The tunnel vision that had been narrowing her world to a pinpoint of terror started to expand again as her nervous system recognized safety and began to stand down from crisis mode. Rick Thompson's reaction was immediate and explosive. He shot to his feet with such violence that his chair toppled backward, crashing to the floor with a sound like breaking bones. His face had progressed beyond purple to an alarming shade that suggested his blood pressure had reached dangerous levels. "This is outrageous," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the courtroom walls like thunder in a canyon. "Your Honor, this is clearly orchestrated manipulation designed to prejudice these proceedings. That animal has no business in this courtroom, and I demand its immediate removal." Rick's law enforcement background had taught him to recognize tactical advantages and strategic positioning. In his fury and paranoia, he interpreted Ranger's presence as a calculated move by Sarah's legal team to gain sympathy and sway the judge's decision through emotional manipulation. He couldn't see past his own rage to recognize that what was happening had nothing to do with legal strategy, and everything to do with a child's desperate need for comfort. "Mr. Thompson." Judge Morrison's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, but Rick was beyond the reach of judicial warnings. His anger had consumed his ability to think rationally or consider consequences. "She's using our daughter as a pawn." Rick continued his tirade, jabbing his finger toward Sarah with renewed venom. "This whole thing is staged. She probably trained that dog to respond on cue. Everything about this woman is fake, manipulative, calculated." Sarah Chun looked up from her hands, with eyes red from crying, but blazing with maternal fury. For months, she had endured Rick's accusations with quiet dignity, absorbing his attacks while trying to maintain some semblance of professional composure. But watching him attack her daughter's moment of healing broke something fundamental inside her. "How dare you?" Sarah whispered, her voice carrying more power than Rick's shouting. "Look at her, Rick. Really look at her. When was the last time you saw Maya breathe normally? When was the last time she wasn't afraid?" Judge Morrison was indeed looking at Maya, and what she saw defied every rule in her judicial handbook. The child who had been in the grip of a severe panic attack just moments before was now breathing easily, her small body relaxed against Ranger's warm flank. Maya's eyes, which had been wide with terror throughout the entire proceeding, now held something Judge Morrison rarely saw in her courtroom piece. The legal implications were staggering. Allowing an unauthorized animal to remain in active court proceedings could provide grounds for appeal, could be seen as judicial bias, could potentially invalidate any ruling she made. But removing Ranger now would mean watching a vulnerable child descend back into psychological crisis. And Judge Morrison had not spent 2 decades protecting children, only to sacrifice one on the altar of legal technicalities. Margaret Walsh, Sarah's attorney, recognized the pivotal moment and rose carefully to her feet. "Your Honor, if I may address the court's concerns about proper protocol." "The protocol is clear," Rick interrupted, his voice reaching levels that made the court reporter wince. "Animals are prohibited. This is a legal proceeding, not a therapy session." But Judge Morrison was watching something far more compelling than legal arguments. She was watching Maya's small hand stroke Ranger's fur with the automatic motion of someone who had found their anchor in a storm. She was watching a service dog perform exactly the function he had been trained for, providing life-saving intervention to someone in psychological crisis. She was watching a miracle disguised as a violation of courthouse rules. The weight of Solomon's wisdom pressed down on Judge Morrison's shoulders as she prepared to make a decision that would define not only this case, but possibly her entire judicial legacy. The silence that followed Judge Morrison's decision stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. Her words, "The dog stays," hung in the air with the weight of a judicial ruling that would echo through family court history for decades to come. The mahogany-paneled courtroom, which had witnessed countless legal precedents over its 80-year history, had never heard anything quite like it. Rick Thompson's face underwent a transformation that defied medical explanation. The dangerous purple flush drained away instantly, replaced by a pallor so complete that he looked like a man who had just witnessed his own death sentence. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish gasping for water, as his legal mind struggled to process what had just occurred. 20 years of police work and countless courtroom appearances had never prepared him for a judge who would prioritize a child's emotional welfare over established legal protocol. "Your Honor," Rick's voice cracked like a teenager's, all his earlier bombast evaporating in the face of judicial authority that had just ruled against everything he understood about courtroom procedure. "I must formally object to this unprecedented violation of—" Judge Morrison's gavel came down with the force of Thor's hammer, his sharp crack echoing through the stunned courtroom like a gunshot. Her steel-gray eyes blazed with an intensity that had intimidated defense attorneys and unruly defendants for over 2 decades. When she spoke, her voice carried the absolute authority of someone who had just made peace with sacrificing her reputation for the sake of a child's well-being. "Mr. Thompson, you will sit down and you will remain silent until I call for your response," she commanded, her words cutting through his objections like a blade through tissue paper. "In 23 years on this bench, I have never seen more compelling demonstration of genuine therapeutic necessity. This court recognizes that we are witnessing an active medical intervention, not a circus act." The transformation in Maya was nothing short of miraculous. Where moments before had sat a child in the grip of a severe psychological crisis, now sat a little girl whose breathing had returned to normal, whose color had returned to her cheeks, whose small hands were buried peacefully in Ranger's thick fur. The service dog remained perfectly still beside her chair, his intelligent amber eyes vigilant but calm, his powerful body serving as both anchor and shield against the storm of adult emotions that continued to rage around them. Judge Morrison called for an immediate recess, but not the brief 5-minute break typically used for legal consultations. This was an emergency session that would require expert testimony, psychological evaluation, and consultation with specialists who had never before been asked to weigh in on such an unprecedented situation. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Maya remained in her chair with Ranger beside her, the two of them creating an island of peace in the chaos of legal upheaval. Dr. Patricia Henley, the court's consulting child psychologist, arrived within 30 minutes of Judge Morrison's emergency call. A woman in her 50s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, Dr. Henley had spent 25 years specializing in childhood trauma and had testified in over 300 custody cases. She had never, however, been asked to evaluate the therapeutic value of a service dog's intervention during active court proceedings. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Henley murmured as she knelt beside Maya's chair, her trained eyes taking in every detail of the child's improved condition. She checked Maya's pulse, observed her breathing pattern, noted the relaxation in her facial muscles, and the normal color of her skin. Her physiological signs indicate she's moved completely out of the panic attack state. A transformation is medically significant. Dr. Amanda Torres, a specialist in animal-assisted therapy from the University of Washington Medical School, had been hastily summoned to provide expert testimony about service dog interventions. A veterinary behaviorist with dual degrees in psychology and animal science, Dr. Torres examined Ranger's positioning, his alert but calm demeanor, and the way he maintained protective contact with Maya while remaining non-disruptive to the legal proceedings. "This is textbook deep pressure therapy," Dr. Torres explained to Judge Morrison during the private consultation. "Ranger is performing exactly the function he was trained for, providing grounding and emotional regulation to someone experiencing severe psychological distress. The fact that he responded to the child's signal demonstrates the effectiveness of his training and the genuine nature of her need." Colonel Rodriguez provided crucial background information about Maya's relationship with Ranger during their summer visits. She described watching Maya learn to manage her anxiety through interaction with the service dog, noting how the child had developed her own coping mechanisms by observing Ranger's therapeutic techniques with Elena's PTSD episodes. Maya taught herself to communicate with Ranger using our military signals. Colonel Rodriguez testified, her voice steady with military precision. She wasn't manipulating the situation. She was using survival skills that she learned to help herself cope with psychological trauma. That child has been living in a war zone created by adult anger, and she found her own way to call for backup. The expert testimonies painted a devastating picture of a child who had been suffering in silence, developing sophisticated coping mechanisms to survive the psychological warfare of her parents' divorce. Dr. Henley's evaluation revealed that Maya had been experiencing panic attacks for months, nightmares about her parents fighting, and had even stopped eating regularly due to stress-induced nausea. Your Honor, Dr. Henley concluded, removing that service dog now would constitute psychological cruelty. Maya has found a therapeutic intervention that works, and disrupting it could cause significant regression in her mental health. Judge Morrison spent 45 minutes in her chambers, consulting legal precedents, reviewing child welfare statutes, and wrestling with a decision that could define the rest of her judicial career. She emerged with a ruling that would be quoted in family law textbooks for generations. Children's therapeutic needs could supersede traditional courtroom protocol when expert testimony supported the intervention's necessity. When court reconvened, Rick Thompson's attorney had arrived, a sharp-dressed, corporate lawyer who immediately began filing objections and appeals that would tie up the case for months. But Judge Morrison's unprecedented ruling held firm. Ranger would remain with Maya for the duration of all proceedings, serving as her emotional support system while the adults continued their legal battle. The case had evolved from a simple custody dispute into a groundbreaking example of trauma-informed judicial decision-making. Maya's silent cry for help had not only brought her the comfort she desperately needed, but had opened the family court system's eyes to revolutionary new approaches to protecting children caught in the crossfire of adult conflict. As the afternoon session prepared to resume, Maya sat peacefully beside her four-legged guardian, her small hand resting on Ranger's warm flank. She had no idea that her desperate signal for help had just changed legal history forever. The extended recess that followed Judge Morrison's unprecedented ruling transformed the Seattle courthouse into a hive of investigative activity, unlike anything the building had witnessed in its 8 decades of service. Court investigators, child advocates, psychologists, and legal experts descended upon the case with the intensity of detectives working a major crime scene. What they discovered in the following hours would shake the foundation of everything the adults thought they knew about Maya Thompson's silent suffering. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the court-appointed child advocate who had been assigned to Maya's case 3 months earlier, had initially believed she was dealing with a routine custody dispute complicated by parental animosity. She had observed Maya during previous hearings, noting the child's unusual quietness and withdrawal, but had attributed it to normal stress from the divorce proceedings. Now, with Ranger's calming presence allowing Maya to speak more freely, Dr. Walsh was uncovering a horrifying landscape of psychological trauma that had been hidden beneath the surface of a seemingly well-behaved child. Maya, can you tell me about the nightmares you've been having? Dr. Walsh asked gently, her voice barely above a whisper as they sat in a small conference room adjacent to the courtroom. Maya remained close to Ranger, her small hand maintaining constant contact with his fur, as if the connection were a lifeline keeping her anchored to safety. Maya's voice came out in halting whispers, each word carefully considered as if speaking. Too loudly might summon the demons that had been haunting her sleep. They fight in my dreams too. Daddy throws things, and Mommy cries, and I try to make myself really small so they won't see me. But they keep getting louder and louder until I can't breathe. The revelation hit Dr. Walsh like a physical blow. Maya had been experiencing what psychologists call trauma dreams, nightmares that replay and amplify real-life experiences of psychological terror. But more disturbing was what Maya revealed next. She had been secretly studying military tactics to survive her own home. Great-Grandma Elena taught me about being quiet when there's danger, Maya continued, her eyes never leaving Ranger's face. She showed me how soldiers talk without making sound, how they call for backup when they're scared. I practiced every day, because I knew someday I might need help, and there wouldn't be any grown-ups who could hear me. Dr. Walsh's hands trembled as she took notes, realizing that an 8-year-old child had been preparing for psychological warfare in what should have been the safest place on earth, her own family. Maya had essentially been living as a prisoner of war, developing survival strategies that most adults never needed to learn. The military hand signals weren't a game or a cute trick. They were survival tools that a desperate child had acquired to cope with domestic trauma. The investigation deepened when Dr. Sarah Martinez, a specialist in childhood anxiety disorders, arrived to conduct a comprehensive psychological evaluation, using play therapy techniques and age-appropriate assessment tools. Dr. Martinez uncovered layer upon layer of hidden trauma that Maya had been carrying alone for months. Maya, can you show me with these dolls what happens at home when Mommy and Daddy talk? Dr. Martinez asked, arranging small figurines on a table. Maya's play session revealed a child who had been living in a constant state of hypervigilance. She positioned the adult dolls at opposite ends of the table, then made the child doll hide behind furniture, cover her ears, and eventually crawl away to find the dog doll. The symbolism was heartbreaking and unmistakable. Maya had been psychologically fleeing to Ranger, even in her imagination, rehearsing scenarios where her four-legged friend could provide the safety that the adult world had failed to give her. When the fighting starts, I count to 100 in my head, Maya whispered to the dolls as if they were confidants. If it doesn't stop by 100, I do the signals in my mind, pretending Ranger is coming to get me. Sometimes it helps the scared feeling go away. Dr. Martinez documented Maya's coping mechanisms with growing alarm. The child had developed what psychologists call dissociative strategies, mental techniques for escaping psychological trauma that were typically seen in combat veterans or abuse survivors. Maya had been teaching herself to mentally separate from her physical environment when the emotional violence became unbearable. The most devastating discovery came when investigators interviewed Maya's teachers at Willowbrook Elementary School. Mrs. Patterson, Maya's third-grade teacher, revealed that Maya's academic performance had declined dramatically over the past 6 months, coinciding exactly with the escalation of her parents' divorce proceedings. She used to be one of my brightest students, Mrs. Patterson explained to Dr. Walsh with tears in her eyes. But lately, she zones out during lessons, jumps at sudden noises, and sometimes I catch her making these tiny hand movements under her desk. I thought she was just fidgeting, but now I realize she was probably practicing those military signals. The school counselor, Mr. Rodriguez, added even more disturbing details. Maya had been found several times in the bathroom during recess, sitting alone and appearing to have conversations with an invisible companion. When questioned, she had explained that she was talking to Ranger, and that he was helping her feel brave enough to go back to class. She was essentially self-medicating with imaginary animal therapy, Dr. Martinez explained to Judge Morrison during a private consultation. This child created an entire internal support system based on her relationship with that service dog, because she had no other reliable source of comfort or safety. The investigators also discovered that Maya had stopped eating lunch regularly, often giving her food to classmates or throwing it away untouched. Her teacher had noticed the weight loss, but attributed it to growth spurts rather than stress-induced appetite suppression. Maya had been literally wasting away under the psychological pressure of her parents' war, and nobody had recognized the signs. Perhaps most heartbreaking was the revelation that Maya had been keeping a secret journal, written in a mixture of English and the military hand signals Colonel Rodriguez had taught her. The entries revealed a child desperately trying to make sense of a world where the two people she loved most had become enemies, where love had transformed into weapons, and where her only reliable source of comfort was a dog who lived 3 hours away. "Dear Ranger," one entry read in Maya's careful 8-year-old handwriting, "I practiced the help signal 50 times today. I hope I remember it right, if I need it for real." Mommy cried at breakfast, and Daddy slammed the door so hard. The picture fell off the wall. "I wish you lived with us. I wish somebody could make them remember how to be nice." As the evidence mounted, it became clear that Maya's silent signal in the courtroom hadn't been a desperate improvisation. It had been the culmination of months of preparation by a child who had been systematically teaching herself survival skills because the adult world had failed to protect her from psychological warfare in her own home. The hidden truth that emerged during those crucial hours would reshape not only the custody case, but the entire understanding of how children cope with domestic trauma when they believe no one is listening to their silent cries for help. 6 months after that storm-lashed day in Seattle Family Court, Maya Thompson-Chun ran across the emerald grass of Colonel Rodriguez's ranch in the Cascade foothills, her laughter echoing off the mountain peaks like music that had finally found its proper key. The transformation was so complete, so miraculous, that visitors often had trouble believing this vibrant, confident child was the same terrified little girl who had once sat frozen in a courtroom, drowning in her parents' hatred. Ranger bounded beside her through the wildflower meadow, his copper and charcoal coat gleaming in the late afternoon sunlight. At 8 years old now, he had slowed slightly from his military working dog prime, but his devotion to Maya remained absolute. They played their own version of tactical training. Maya would hide behind trees and use hand signals to call him, and he would respond with the precision that had once saved lives in Afghanistan, but now served the infinitely more important purpose of healing a child's wounded spirit. The custody case that had become known throughout the Pacific Northwest legal community as Thompson versus Chun, the Ranger Protocol, had concluded with a revolutionary ruling that would be studied in law schools for decades to come. Judge Morrison's groundbreaking decision had not only addressed the immediate custody question, but had fundamentally changed how family courts approached cases involving childhood trauma and therapeutic interventions. Maya's primary residence was now with her mother, Dr. Sarah Chun, in a modest craftsman house just 20 minutes from Seattle General Hospital. The proximity allowed Sarah to maintain her demanding residency schedule while ensuring she could be home for breakfast, dinner, and bedtime stories, the precious moments of motherhood that she had fought so desperately to reclaim. The house featured a special room that had been designated as Maya's safe space, equipped with soft lighting, comfortable pillows, and most importantly, a bed large enough for both a little girl and a visiting German shepherd. The visitation arrangement with Rick Thompson had been carefully structured around mandatory therapy and anger management counseling. Dr. Patricia Henley, the court's consulting psychologist, had worked with Rick for months to help him understand how his explosive anger had terrorized his own daughter. The breakthrough came when Rick was shown video footage of Maya's panic attack in the courtroom. Seeing his child's terror through objective eyes finally shattered his defensive denial and forced him to confront the damage his rage had inflicted. "I thought I was protecting her," Rick had whispered during one particularly difficult therapy session, tears streaming down the face that had once been purple with fury. "I thought if I fought hard enough for custody, she would understand that I loved her. I never realized I was the monster she needed protection from." Rick's supervised visits now took place in a neutral location with Dr. Henley present, focusing on rebuilding trust through calm interaction, and consistent emotional safety. Maya had been hesitant at first, her body tensing whenever her father's voice began to rise above normal conversation levels. But gradually, with Ranger often present as emotional support and Rick's genuine commitment to change, father and daughter began to rediscover the loving relationship that had been buried beneath months of legal warfare. Colonel Rodriguez had become an official part of Maya's support system, with court-mandated visits every other weekend at the ranch. These trips served dual purposes. They allowed Maya to maintain her crucial bond with Ranger while providing her with a stable, peaceful environment where she could process her experiences with someone who understood both trauma and recovery. Elena had seen soldiers return from war zones with invisible wounds, and she recognized that Maya was essentially a veteran of domestic psychological combat who needed time and space to heal. She's learning that not all adult voices carry anger. Colonel Rodriguez explained to Dr. Henley during one of their monthly progress consultations. When I speak to Ranger using commands, Maya hears authority without rage, direction without destruction. It's teaching her that grown-ups can be strong without being scary. The ranch visits had become therapeutic retreats where Maya practiced new coping skills in a controlled environment. She learned meditation techniques while sitting beside Ranger in the morning sun, developed confidence through helping care for Elena's small herd of rescue horses, and most importantly, discovered that she could trust adults to keep their promises and control their emotions. Maya's academic performance had returned to its former excellence, but with a new dimension that amazed her teachers. She had become a peer counselor of sorts, using her unique experience to help other children who seemed withdrawn or anxious. Her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, often found Maya sitting with classmates who were upset, teaching them simple breathing techniques she had learned from Dr. Martinez, or showing them how to count to 100 when feelings became overwhelming. Maya has transformed her survival skills into healing skills. Dr. Martinez observed during Maya's 6-month psychological evaluation. She's taken the trauma that nearly destroyed her and turned it into empathy and resilience that she uses to help others. It's remarkable. The legal precedent established by Judge Morrison's ruling had rippled through family court systems across the country. The Ranger Protocol was now cited in training manuals for family court judges, and several jurisdictions had begun pilot programs incorporating therapy animals into traumatic custody proceedings. Maya's desperate signal for help had not only saved her own life, but had opened the door for countless other children to access therapeutic support during the most vulnerable moments of their lives. Maya herself had become something of a local celebrity, though she remained largely unaware of her impact on legal history. Local news stations had featured her story. Child psychology conferences had presented case studies based on her experience. And the military working dog training facility, where Ranger had been trained now, included a special curriculum on recognizing and responding to childhood trauma signals. But for Maya, the most important change was simpler and more profound than any legal precedent or media attention. She had learned that she was worthy of protection, that her voice, whether spoken or silent, had power, and that love could exist without conditions or warfare. As she sat on the ranch porch that evening, watching the sun set behind the Cascade Mountains with Ranger's warm weight pressed against her side, Maya Chun Thompson had finally found what every child deserves: a world where she felt safe, heard, and unconditionally loved. Her secret signal had done more than summon help in a moment of crisis. It had summoned justice, healing, and hope for children everywhere who needed someone to hear their silent cries for rescue. In learning to call for help, Maya had taught the entire world how to listen.